Hi everyone again,
Hello.
and welcome to number 3 in the last week of our study. So we're getting right towards the end, Pam.
I can see the finishing line.
Yeah, 2 more days. Come on. So the last couple of weeks we've been looking at kind of how the big story affects how we read the Bible, how we develop our theology. So you all good with that?
Mm-hmm.
That means, what else is there to do?
You were going to do another issue.
No more issues, no more themes. We'll leave that for everybody else.
I can't remember, sorry.
Well, what I wanted to do today is just to give us a bit of a kind of
How
thoughts.
to teach.
Well, a little bit more on kind of the way forward in getting to know the Bible better.
Okay.
So yeah, it does come into how we teach it, but yeah, really for personal study as well. How do we go deeper with the Bible? So there's we've looked at the story, and the Bible is actually majority story. We call it narrative as a way of looking at the type of literature. And so we see there various stories playing out, and those teach us something. Now obviously we have to be a bit careful, because Jewish literature tends not to give us kind of like a moral commentary on things. So sometimes we'll read something and think, that's horrendous. And the Bible doesn't seem to make a comment about it. And some people in reading it can think, well, that must be okay then. Look, it's this person who's, a great patriarch or father in the Bible, so he's doing that, so it must be fine. And that can lead us into all sorts of trouble. It's like Jacob taking 4 wives, and so many people will say now, well, Jacob did it. He's like the father of the nation of Israel. Took 4 wives. God didn't say that's wrong.
Would you want to?
Nowhere in the 10 Commandments it says that. But exactly, as you look at the story itself tells you, if you go that way, you're heading for trouble. So, you read it, and it's actually the story itself that is explaining it, and saying, look at all the conflict, look at all the jealousy, look at how it disrupts family life, even the relationships between the children.
I think one wife is more than enough.
I think so. We don't need any more, do we? So that's something that we need to see from the kind of how the story plays out.
Okay.
Today I want to tell you a little bit more about the way that the Jews understood their scriptures, because they would call it meditation literature. In other words, this is stuff that isn't just to be read at one level. The story is great, that gives us some insights, but there's actually more going on, and it takes time and effort. It takes actually looking deeper, meditating on it, kind of chewing it over, I think is the way that it's described. Chewing it, thinking it through. And what you find is that there are a number of different things that the writers use to get the point that they want to make across. So we're going to look at probably 4 different ways today that the writers will use. So they obviously use repeated stories. They'll use patterns of things that have happened before. They use numbers. Sometimes numbers are used and are repeated. So you get all these different things that are like patterns that you've read before in one way or another. And I'm hoping that you'll see that as they are repeated, so the themes come through. Okay, so the easiest thing is probably to actually look at it.
By pattern, do you mean when something happens and you just think, oh, this is like when that thing happened?
Exactly, yeah.
Like, for me, often God does things with dates.
Dates.
Have I ever told you that?
Oh, right, no.
No, often things will happen on the same date, and it's just like this little pattern, I think. Oh, that's so weird,
Okay.
because 4 years ago that was happening.
Oh, wow. Well, I never knew that. You have to tell me when that's coming up.
It's a whole new YouTube channel.
Yeah. But there is things that repeat. It does seem that God seems to like to put these things on repeat, just to kind of show our attention. I think we talked about, so one of the things it uses is words. Particular words will come again and again. So I was thinking of the term offspring. That comes up again and again. So remember in the Garden of Eden when the serpent is cursed, and God says the woman's offspring will crush your head and you will bite its heel. There's this thing of an expectation of offspring, and so whenever offspring is used, it often comes with that connotation of, oh, this is part of this cosmic battle. So obviously Abraham is the next one that would have, something about being promised offspring. That again is meant to make you think back, this is the promise of the Garden of Eden now coming about through Abraham and his offspring.
And they'll go to battle with the enemy.
Yeah.
Never thought about it.
So Isaiah, remember the virgin will be with child, and there's an offspring coming that he wants to talk about that's going to become this great ruler, the Prince of Peace, of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end. So again, this offspring coming through. So when the gospel starts, Matthew puts down this genealogy of all the children that have been born, right down to Jesus, and then he talks about Jesus' birth, this offspring to come. And Revelation, actually, there's a woman in Revelation that gives birth to the offspring, and that is going to be the ruler. So you see these words coming through again and again, and so it's quite useful sometimes to follow that and see how it works through. So we've got words, stories, repeating stories. So the temptation of Adam and Eve would be a classic repeating story. That the words that were used around the temptation there, they saw, and then they desired, and they took, and that is then repeated a number of times. So it was talked about Abraham actually with his servant Hagar. They together, Abraham and Sarah, they saw and they desired a child, and they took Hagar, and it's and obviously it was a major downer in the story there. Who else can you think of? Anyone else that's done, kind of seen something, desired and taken it? David was the classic, yeah.
Okay.
I thought you'd get that one. So David was one. He saw, he reached, he desired, and he took Bathsheba. Achan was one who saw the treasure in the tents of the Canaanites, when Joshua was going in to take the land, and Joshua said, "Don't take any of the treasure; that all belongs to God." But Achan saw it, and he desired it, and took it and hid it in his tent, and that's why they lost the battles. So there are these repeating themes of temptation, which is why when you get to Jesus, and he's in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's come through all his temptations, and he's lived out the way that God has called him to live. But in the Garden of Gethsemane is like his moment of saying, "Take this away from me. I can't do this, God." And there's this battle raging there in the garden as he prays and sweats. And in that moment he says, "Yet not my will, but yours." There's this moment where all the other characters that have come on the scene have failed in one way or another, but we find Jesus succeeding, going through, and his temptation story is different from all the others. So you can see those stories repeating, and why, they put Jesus, I guess, as the hero there. Okay, so words, stories, patterns. So you see often things repeated, like for instance the chaos waters. Remember when we started the whole creation and the waters? There was nothing but these chaotic waters that were everywhere, and the Spirit hovered over, and that's the beginning of creation as God starts to order those things. But the chaos waters crop up again and again. Something to do with water, and how God removing his hand allows this chaos to come. So the flood is the obvious one. Mm-hmm. So going back to decreation, God taking his hand away and allowing the creation to kind of cave in on itself. That's that's how it comes. But you see it again in the Exodus story as the Israelites come out through the waters.
Okay, yeah.
And then the waters crash down, and the chaos ensues after God's people have gone through. Then he allows it to just leave chaos and destruction. That's so again, kind of the chaos waters come in there. Joshua goes through the waters into the promised land.
Where are you getting all this from?
This is just part of this. You just see it coming up again and again.
Okay.
So obviously Jesus goes through the waters of baptism, and why baptism became such an important part of the early church, as they were reenacting their coming out of the chaos, out of their sinful ways, and into resurrection, into the new life. So those are the kind of things that the Jews spent their lives kind of looking through and seeing, oh look, there's a pattern here. These things...
Didn't they? They just loved patterns.
Yeah, they're looking for it all the time. So, obviously numbers, you know that 7 is a repeated number, we've talked about that, it keeps on coming up. The number 40, often number 40 talks about the faithfulness of people being tested. 40 days, 40 years in the wilderness, 40 days of flooding. Again, it's this kind of sense of people being tested. Jesus, 40 days in the wilderness, his faithfulness being tested. So again, you just look for those different things and see, okay, I've heard that before. Where's it come from? So we've got that. That tends to be in our narrative, but of course, a huge amount of the Bible is poetry. All the prophetic books, the Psalms, all of that, majority is poetry. And so again, you see these sort of words being used, and they become metaphors. So what was a narrative, part of the story previously, then starts to be used as a metaphor. Do you understand what I mean by that? So for instance, they take the chaos waters, these waters that are uncontrolled. They're not under God's order. They're kind of doing their own thing, and then Isaiah in his prophecy will then refer to the nations of the world being like that. They're like these waters, these chaotic waters that are doing their own thing. I'll read you a bit just so you can see what I mean. Isaiah 17. Where are you? Okay, so he says, oh, the raging of many nations, they rage like the raging sea. Oh, the uproar of the peoples, they roar like the roaring of great waters. Although the peoples roar like the roar of surging waters, when he rebukes them, they flee far away. So you can see that. I mean, Isaiah is starting a prophetic ministry, challenging all the nations around Israel at that time, and he starts it by likening them to these chaos waters, and saying God is going to speak. Now we could just read that and think, okay, yeah, he's kind of talking about them as raging waters for some reason. But when you have the background of the chaos waters and what that means, then we start to kind of look at it on a deeper level. You start to understand more of the metaphors that these poets are using. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so those are the kind of things. So the chaos waters, I just noticed that when you get to the book of Revelation, there's this sea of glass.
Oh.
It's nice, isn't it? That's what he sees in the throne room.
Like everything's finished.
Yeah, it's calm. Sea of glass, not a ripple on there. Nothing impure or out of order. So, but you'd miss that. If you hadn't understood these metaphors, you'd think, is there a sea of glass? What does that mean? But actually he's referring back all the way, back to the beginning. And often the things the poets use that were used in narrative earlier on are now being used as metaphors. He's taking something that was part of a story,
okay,
and he's using it, so he'll use the garden imagery. So what was part of the narrative, part of the story, the Garden of Eden, then becomes, that's how some of the prophets will talk about, you'll sit under your own tree, you'll tend your vines. Part of this is the restoration of the people of God, because he's referring back to when God and man lived together in perfect harmony. So the garden or the mountain, again, all those things that you think, okay, he's talking about a garden, he's talking about a mountain. No, that's why he's talking about it.
Okay.
So again, these things, it takes time to talk it through, to think it through. But that leads us on to the one of the major ways that the Bible communicates, which is what we call the apocalyptic literature, which is by far the most confusing. Poetry we can kind of understand, but apocalyptic literature are things like the book of Daniel, the book of Zechariah, and particularly the book of Revelation, where people read that and go, what? There's dragons, there's beasts, there's all sorts of fire and brimstone and various things. What is that all about? We've got ourselves so confused. But hold tight on this. The apocalyptic books are just referring back to other symbols that have already been used. It's symbolic language. Okay? A classic one is the beasts. The beasts of Revelation. All this, the mark of the beast, and people get really into these things. What is that? Well, you can see. What is the beast? Well, the beasts were created on the 6th day, alongside humanity. But humanity was the one that carried the image of God, not the beasts. And yet when we act in rebellion to God, it's like we become like beasts. That's how Cain and Abel, you remember, the beast that was waiting at the door, waiting to seize him. That's what happens when you live in rebellion to God. You start acting like the beasts. And so when Daniel uses this vision of the beasts, he sees these beasts coming, and they've got various heads of different animals and stuff. But you realise, and he does talk about this, that these are the different kingdoms that are arising in his day. These different beasts are the kingdoms of men that are devoid of God. And they act like beasts. They're cruel, they're harsh, They're destructive. They're like the Babylon that we talked about, the oppression and the violence. And he sees these kingdoms coming up and he calls them beasts. So now we see in the book of Revelation, beasts again, various beasts coming up out of off the land, out of the sea. Oh, are these literal beasts? No, they're just what we've seen before. These political powers or these religious powers that come and that come to oppress people. So the book of Revelation is complex, not easy, but if we keep in mind that most of the imagery has been used before and we go back to see what was it used for then it gives us keys to understanding what it's all about.
Okay.
Okay. Has this been at all helpful?
Yeah, I need to lie down. It's just too much.
Okay. What I was trying to do here is to give you a little track for where we could go with this. I mean, this is why the Bible takes a lifetime to study.
No, I want to listen to it and write, and then I'll get it all.
Yes, there's huge amounts in this. This is why the Bible was never meant to be read just you and Jesus. This is why the Bible was meant to be in community, because the things that I see, I mean, most of the things that I see, I didn't get myself. I've read that from others that have studied. And I've studied stuff, and maybe a little bit that I've seen can encourage others, but really we do it as a community. It's a lifetime study together as a community, learning about what the Word of God really means in all its fullness. And we've got different layers. So we've got the big story, but within that we've got these other stories, these words, these patterns that are reinforcing what the story is all about, ultimately to bring us to Jesus. So that's
Thanks, Colin.
Okay, join us tomorrow for our last session. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye now.
Bye.